This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 7 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm Dustin Chandry. I'm recording on Labor Day, September 4th, and we have finally arrived. The start of the NFL regular season is later this week. But for episode 6, I want to focus on some things that I will be keeping a close eye on come week 1 of the NFL season. You see, as analysts, there's still a fair number of assumptions that go into our preseason projections, and then we use those projections to help build our analysis and our recommendations. However, I'm really just like you. I'm just a guy sitting at his computer looking at stats and watching games. I don't have any special access to NFL teams. And there are projections that I have more certainty or confidence in than I do others. For example, I have more confidence in projecting Derrick Henry than I do Travis Etienne. There are more variables at play, like snap share and target share, that'll have a wider range of outcomes for Etienne than Henry. And you see, once we get real regular season game data, we may need to go back and revise some of our assumptions. And of course, this has downstream effects for the rest of the season, even as simple things such as, your weekly start sits, your waiver wire pickups, in-season trades, things like that. And because of this, there are certain things that I will be looking for after week 1. These are the things that I may want to revise my assumptions if something in my expectations doesn't match the reality of week 1. So here are the items I am going to be paying close attention to in week 1. So there is this adage in fantasy football around some teams where somebody has to catch the ball, right? There's questions about who's the top receiving option on that team. You think the Chicago Bears last year, the Houston Texans this year. But for Chicago last year, they were last in the league in attempts, so it really didn't matter who the top receiving option was because none of them had any value. But what if the team consistently has been in the top 5 of pass attempts for the last 5 years and it has the best quarterback in the game? Of course, I'm talking about the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, outside of Travis Kelce, who can we point to and rely on in one of the league's best offenses? You have Juju Smith-Schuster and Mecole Hardman have both left via free agency, and they have left behind about a fifth of targets and fantasy points for someone else in this offense to inherit. And of course, you have 3 main candidates. You have Marquez Valdes-Scantling, MVS, you have Sky Moore, and you have Kadarius Toney. Now, Kadarius Toney, of course, has the best advanced metrics, but he has an extremely small sample size. Last year, he only played 100 snaps, and he had 17 targets. That's it, 17 targets on the year. His catch rate was over 80%. His target per route rate was over 25%, which was just under a hair of what Travis Kelce had. His yards per route run was the best on the team at 2.7, but again, his sample is just insanely small. Early camp reports said that he was going to be the wide receiver 1, but then he got hurt again. And as of a few days ago, I think we were expecting him to miss the start of the season. Now, it sounds like he's going to play week 1, but there's still no reports yet if he's a full go or if he'll be limited to a snap count. And then you got Sky Moore, who I think was a disappointment in his rookie year. I mean, Toney scored more points than Sky Moore did last year, and he only played a third of the snap volume that Sky Moore did. He did have a target per route run rate above 20%, which is solid, but his lack of routes run was a problem, and he kind of just seemed to be otherwise forgotten last year. And then, of course, you have the veteran MVS. Now, there were only 4 players on the Chiefs last year that had a target share above 10%. Kelce, Juju, who is now gone, Jerick McKinnon out of the backfield, and MVS. He had over 80 targets and led the team in air yards as their primary deep threat. And MVS is actually rostered in less than a quarter of all fantasy leagues right now. Now, in all likelihood, none of these guys I think are going to be reliable enough to start in your weekly lineups early in the season. Toney, I think, is the only one who comes close, but his injury history is a red flag. And other than Mahomes, Kelsey, and I think McKinnon will have some flex value, I don't recommend you start any Kansas City wide receiver until we see week 1 play out. Now, since I brought up the Bears passing game from last year, I will be closely monitoring their week 1 game against the Packers. Of course, last year they were last in the league in pass attempts, and history of teams that were last in the league the following year is not very favorable. And in fact, the average increase in pass attempts from the following year for the team that was last in the league in pass attempts was only 2.5. And many are expecting Justin Fields to kind of make this leap as a passer, both in volume and efficiency, but right now I just don't see the historical evidence to support that. And furthermore, what's the target share on this offense going to be like with the addition of DJ Moore, and you have a healthy Chase Claypool and a healthy Darnell Mooney, and you still have other options in the offense? I'm still projecting this to be a low-volume pass offense with a highly fragmented target share. Now, if their passing volume increases significantly, we'll have to change our expectations, right? Fields only averaged 21 pass attempts a game last year. If Fields pushes his pass attempts in week 1 up into the high 20s, closer to 30, and DJ Moore has a target share above 25%, then we will need to adjust our expectations upward for both players. Another wide receiver on a low-volume offense I'm closely watching is Chris Olave and the New Orleans Saints. So I can't express this enough, just how great Chris Olave was as a rookie last year. In the entire league, Olave was 8th in targets per route run. He was 6th in fantasy points per snaps played. The only players who actually scored more points on a per-snap basis: Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Jalen Waddle. That's it. Those are the only guys. Olave had over 25% target share, and he only had 4 touchdowns on a very high usage rate, so he could have positive touchdown regression coming his way. Now, the Saints, just like the Bears, were also near the league low in passing attempts. They were 27th overall in pass attempts last year with Andy Dalton at quarterback most of the year. Now you enter Derek Carr as the Saints' new quarterback, and in similar fashion, if we see the Saints increase their passing attempts closer to the league average, then Olave has wide receiver 1 upside in fantasy. And in general, I have to be monitoring what the snap share is like for all the top running backs in the league. You have a lot of different scenarios at play. You have scenarios like elite running backs who camp reports seem to indicate that they want to scale back their usage, like Austin Eckler, who had over 55% of the Chargers running back snaps last year. You have guys on the franchise tag who are reporting to camp very late, like Josh Jacobs, who had the highest in the league last year. 83% of the team's running back snaps went to Josh Jacobs. That's going to come down. The question is how much. You have situations like Travis Etienne with the Jaguars, who had a dramatic snap share split before and after the trade with James Robinson. The team then invested draft capital in Tank Bigsby, but preseason usage indicates that the 2/3 snap share from last season, it might hold. You have players who didn't have a high snap share last year, but their preseason usage indicates that they might this year. I'm thinking Texans running back Dameon Pierce. And then lastly, you have players inheriting the running back 1 position from a player who had a high snap share last year, and this would be the case of Vikings' Alexander Mattison. Of course, the running back position is always going to be the most fluid due to injuries, and things can quickly change course due to this usage volume. So monitoring what's happening in the early season is really imperative as we get out of the gate. And then lastly, I want to mention this one team and position group that was easily the most difficult to project this season, and that, of course, is the Eagles' running back room. You have DeAndre Swift, Rashad Penny, Kenny Gainwell. I mean, Penny is probably, I think, the most talented pure running back of the group, but of course he's never been able to stay healthy. Swift is very much beloved by kind of the fantasy analyst community, but he was effectively dumped by Detroit, and the Eagles didn't have to pay much to get him. I think that indicates that there just wasn't much of a market for him. And then Gainwell, I think, has had the camp reports that he's the one who's likely to assume the early down role that Miles Sanders left. On top of that, you still have Jalen Hurts that's going to vulture all of them in the red zone. So all these guys could turn out to be league winners, but it's really hard to know at this point. I will say this, though. In standard redraft leagues, Penny and Gainwell are close to free, right? Penny is available in over 20% of leagues, and Gainwell is available in almost 80%. If you can find room at the end of your roster, get them on your roster right now. If they don't hit, you can drop them in a week or two. But these are the type of guys who have league-winning lottery ticket sort of value to them, and you can get them free right now. So that's what I'll be taking a look at in week 1 of the NFL season. And that'll do it for episode 7 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure to hit subscribe. You can follow us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod, and thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.